course you are. Hello, everyone. It's like you haven't caught up in years, the way you're carrying on. Welcome, everyone, to the 2022 Mitchell Oration. It's really great to have you all here. The Mitchell Oration is a lecture series that was created in 2012 with the support of the Harold Mitchell Foundation to provide a forum at which the most pressing development issues could be addressed by the best minds and the most influential practitioners at the time, with topics ranging from the challenges of aid dependency and economic reform in Africa to the Pacific and Indonesia's new wave of economic change. This lecture series has served as a flagship event in the development arena. Past speakers have included Amelia Perez, Jim Adams, Dr. Mari Elka Pangestu, Dr. Mark Dybel, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Professor Sir Richard Feacham, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, and Dr. Natalia Kanem. We're really excited to be staging the Mitchell Oration again, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Stephanie Copus-Campbell, Chair of the Southern Highlands Provincial Health Authority Board in Papua New Guinea, Director on the Family PNG Board, and a previous Director for the Harold Mitchell Foundation. Thank you, Stephanie.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. If I can start by acknowledging the traditional landowners on the land in which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today because I've actually been here from the start. I was on the board of the Harold Mitchell Foundation in 2012 when Stephen Howes came to us and said that he wanted to do something that would have an impact in terms of development, and we agreed both to fund the Development Policy Centre at that time with quite a significant donation, and also out of that to start this oration series. And it's been an incredible journey. I've been to most of them, and I have to say, and with respect to those who started, but they're getting better and better. And I'm really, really happy to be here today and to chair today. And I'm happy because I stand in front of you as a champion for women's empowerment and protection. And I've been a self-appointed champion in every role that I've held, both in Australia and in the countries in which I've worked. And I believe myself to be a champion. I mean, I'm a woman, so that probably makes sense. But it's also the right thing to do, because in every country that I've worked in, there's still a long way to go, and this includes Australia, still a long way to go to achieve gender equity. But it's also, and I've found this out now time and time again, working in the private sector, working in the public sector, working on these issues, it's also a really smart thing to do. And really, everything is better when 100% of our population can reach their full potential. Everything's better. Individuals are happier, families are better off, communities are better off, private sector's better off in the economy, nations are better off, and the world's just a better place. So we all have a role to play in being a champion for gender diversity, women's empowerment and protection. And again, that's why I'm so incredibly pleased to be here today. So it is my pleasure. I found out we didn't coordinate our dress today. I just kind of thought yellow was the thing, and then, but we're well coordinated. And we also have found out, it's my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce Ofakilevuka Guttenbeil-Likiliki today, known to others as Ofa. It's my absolute pleasure to be here, and we found out that not only do we share passion and interest, but also quite a few friends, so that's been very nice having discussion. Ofa is described as an oceanic feminist researcher and storyteller filmmaker, a woman and a children's rights advocate, and the director of the Women and Children's Crisis Centre in Tonga. She is a facilitator and trainer in human rights, gender equity, and women's leadership across the Pacific, and an advisor to the International Women's Development Agency. She's been twice nominated for the United States Secretary of State International Women of Courage Award for her activism and advocacy for women and children's rights in Tonga. Ofa has contributed to research on women's political participation and the impact of COVID-19 on women's economic empowerment in Tonga. And in 2019, she led, with 35 women leaders across the Oceanic Pacific, an impressive piece of research titled Creating Equitable South-North Partnerships, Nurturing the Va and Voyaging the Audacious Ocean Together, that boldly calls for reimagining of global South-North relations in international development and in humanitarian aid spaces. And there's more. Ofa has written and directed 2 films, The Black Pen, that have both been official selections at the international film festivals, including the Hawaiian International Film Festival and the South by Southwest Film Festival. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Ofa here today, but before she steps up, there's a short video that she would like to show you, and then she will step to the podium. Thank you.
We often refrain from using expressions around white supremacy or calling it out because it's frowned upon or looked at as being rude or unkind towards those people or organisations who are just trying to help the Pacific. But when you really get down to it and peel the onion down to its core, it is what it is. White privilege and power underestimating our knowledge and skills, claiming their dominance with things like intrusive logos and acknowledgements, when really all they are funding is the awareness, printing or broadcasting of ideas that were always our ideas to begin with.
Because the global North organizations haven't done their homework, they come in for a short period and then leave. And when they are here, they really have no idea of the groundwork that has been done many years ago. And then they act all excited when they work with our young women, mostly on climate change and leadership. We never meet, or we are never called to any meetings, hardly ever.
We need to talk about our perspectives without fear, like not with fear that a foreign donor may withdraw funds or not want to work with us because we're willing to speak up about the things that they do that don't work in our countries or in our organisations.
It's all about relationships. We will partner up with you because there is something we can collectively change together, and because we both believe in the principles of co-responsibility, co-design and co-creation.
We were not ready to stop our work when we were told our funding was being pulled. I felt a great injustice. Sure, we had to improve in areas of operations, but the overall impact we had in our constituencies spoke for itself. The pulling of funds ultimately came about because our donor had a change of government and the focus shifted from people to money, or whatever they're calling it now as economic empowerment. After that, I just let go and walked away. It was really hard for me to do that, but I did.
I know what I need to do in my country and how to do it because this is my land, my people. But sometimes trying to convey our reality to people sitting somewhere in New York or Europe is like being in a constant email war, and most of the time I feel like they don't believe what I am reporting to them.
Taki he o tua makamati o ki he tau whakalotonga. Pea ko kole ke hūwhanga te ngai whakatapu na e kamata ake kon whelenisini. Ka au hau hake whainga māli e ko imi. Whai atu haki tala noa. Pea whekau akpa mo I ka weinga o ko lele mai moia me Tonga. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathering here today, the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to the Indigenous elders of other communities also here today. And I would like to acknowledge that Australia was founded on the genocide and dispossession of First Nations people, and that sovereignty was never ceded. The voices you heard are the voices I represent today. These are the words of audacious women leaders from across the Oceanic Pacific who have simply had enough. And they were willing to unapologetically share with me their stories for this research. But before I get into the heart of what I want to share with you today, I pause to tell you a bit about myself, a storyteller and a documenter of women's lived realities across the Oceanic Moana Pacific. My name is Ofakilevuka Guttenbeil-Likiliki. And whilst my Pacific cultural identity is strongly rooted and anchored in the land and ocean of Tonga, I also have ancestral roots that are anchored in Samoa, and also to the global north of the minority world of Prussia, Germany, and Ireland. I'm also deeply connected to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the many spaces in between across the wider Oceanic Moana Pacific. It's important for me to set out who I am and my cultural roots and anchoring because it tells a story of who I am today. About 140 years ago, my Prussian-German great-great-grandfather moved to Vava'u, Tonga, in search of trading and business opportunities, something that the locals couldn't do and needed help doing. He was strongly advised against marrying a local Tongan Vava'u girl. Instead, an arranged marriage with the daughter of an Irish businessman who had set up in Samoa was the accepted practice. My great-grandfather, the son of the German and Irish marriage, broke that tradition. And out of his 4 siblings, he was the first and only to marry a local Vava'u Tongan girl, my great-grandmother. They had 11 children, including my granddad. My granddad, being Tongan, German, Irish, ended up marrying a half Samoan, half Tongan girl. And so we came full circle with the Samoa-Tonga connection, but this time a local connection, as opposed to the European settler in Vava'u marrying a European settler in Samoa. I like to call it my family's decolonisation of marriage. Europeans marrying locals was frowned upon and thought of as degrading one's standing in society, a story that's all too familiar with a few of us in this room. But I share this story because embedded in this story is a story of power over and what was wrongly perceived as development. Power over in the sense that my European ancestors had arrived to Tonga and used their Western-influenced knowledge and skills and access to resources to develop for themselves businesses in Tonga, and all the while making sure that they did not marry any locals because the locals were not good enough or at their standards. When intermarriages did happen, children of Pacific and European heritage or half-castes, as we would call them, immediately were elevated in Pacific societies, including Tonga. Their fairer skin tones, European features, foreign surnames gave them a head start by default in many spaces, access to health, education, travel, and employment, just to name a few. They fed into the notion that they were perhaps more superior than their local counterparts who had no white blood running through their veins. They were seen and received as being more developed in terms of the Western concept of development. Being able to speak English, communicate in English, was the only way a local or indigenous person with no European ties could elevate their own standing. So the more you spoke in English and was good at it, the better chance you had in terms of accessing opportunities and resources. 140 years later, there's not that much of a difference between my paternal colonial ancestors' approach to setting up business in Tonga and Samoa to that of development and humanitarian approaches in the Pacific. In the last 3 decades, there is still a sense of we know better, we are better, we know how to make things better. I have been working in this space of ending violence against women and girls over the last 18 years in Tonga. But I experienced something this year that I had never experienced to the extent that I had experienced it this year. I was actually on the brink of losing it. When Tonga underwent a humanitarian crisis in January of this year, the Hunga Tonga Hunga Ha'apai underwater volcanic eruption, followed by a tsunami, the NGO that I work for, the Women and Children Crisis Centre, or WCCC, was one of the first responders on the ground. Within the first 72 hours, carrying out rapid safety assessments with women and children in the most affected communities on Tongatapu. This was followed by ongoing daily psychosocial support to high-risk areas during the response phase. At the same time, Tonga had lost all forms of communication with the outside world. We couldn't telephone or communicate electronically with anyone for about 5 weeks. Within 3 weeks of rolling out the psychosocial support during the response phase, Tonga had its first COVID-19 positive case, which immediately sent the entire country into lockdown and borders closing. In fact, upon reflection from the day of the volcanic eruption in January up until about the end of April, Tonga was dealing with all these issues on their own. I was proud of my team at WCCC and the way we worked during the response phase, approaching our targeted women and children from high-risk areas with care, compassion, and respect, while ensuring that everything we did was based on the key guiding principle of do no harm. We knew exactly what to do, how to do it, and executed it like professionals, albeit with the limited resources we had access to at the time. We would hold debriefs at the end of every day, although tired and worked out, but we wanted to share the stories that we had gathered from the field and identify high-risk cases that needed immediate follow-up. On one of our visits to the most affected areas, the community were in the middle of a meeting about how to distribute donations that had been provided by the local government National Emergency Management Office, or NEMO, churches and NGOs. One of the male leaders had specifically addressed the women who were at the meeting and told them that they were causing way too much trouble by asking too many questions and making too many demands. And so this male leader told the woman to go home and wait for the donations to be distributed. After witnessing this, we moved discreetly into an area outside the hall and invited 2 women's development group leaders to join us in a conversation in the Talanoa while the meeting continued in the hall. We made sure the space we created with these 2 women leaders was safe and that it wouldn't bring too much attention to what we were doing. What turned out to be a 45-minute conversation with these female leaders was the beginning of a relationship that we knew we had to continue nurturing throughout the response phase. What the woman had raised in the hall earlier that day was an urgent request for hygiene products or disinfectants to immediately kill a range of bacteria and viruses that their children elderly, and other members of the family could get diseases from. WCCC immediately worked on this request and was able to work closely with the women in this community and community nurses to enable them to stop the spread of bacteria and viruses. For about 5 to 7 days, our initial psychosocial support was focused on this alone, just helping the woman get through that urgent stage of their most urgent needs. We had gained their trust and respect, and thereafter we commenced our psychosocial talanoa, or conversations, support and advocacy, and we were provided with names and families because of that trust we had built, who were at high risk and the most vulnerable to visit and carry out our AHA strategy. Are you safe? How are you doing right now? Are you being listened to? For example, are you safe? WCCC assessed safe access of women and children to shelters and evacuation areas, safe access to bathrooms, adequate lighting, access to dignity and hygiene kits, access to food and safe drinking water, and access to communication with loved ones and essential services. The majority of women assessed were in a state of shock at how quickly things had transpired and the lack of preparation or warning which had left them shaken. Unlike Tropical Cyclone Gita and Herod, where women felt they had been prepared, the January disaster had left them visibly distressed, traumatized, and worried. How are you doing right now? 10 days after the eruption, 93% of those visited had stated that they had not had any psychosocial support provided prior to our visit. WCCC understood that psychosocial support needed to be differentiated from providing donations or undertaking surveys and moving on from the next household to the next household. We defined it as creating a safe space for talanoa between the counsellor advocate and the woman or child in all their diversities based on our AHA strategy. As I mentioned earlier, WCCC's protocols is based on the key principle around women's safety, do no harm. Is the space safe to ask these women these questions? Or will asking these questions do more harm to her safety? WCCC counsellor advocates have been trained to carefully ask women about their safety from violence and abuse. Only if they felt that the space and environment that the talanoa was being held in was strong enough, the holding environment was strong enough to ask and hold those conversations. Are you being listened to? Talanoa with women about their participation in decision-making and meetings about post-recovery and rebuilding their villages, communities, homes was a key component of WCC's psychosocial support. More than 70% of women who had undergone the psychosocial support from the centre expressed a desire to be part of the conversations and decisions being made about their well-being. However, many of them felt left out and were not being listened to properly. Okay, that was a lot to get through, wasn't it? But all of what I've just said is not what almost sent me to a breaking point. You think it was, but it wasn't. I purposefully explained a summary of what my NGO did immediately after the humanitarian crisis in January, because I wanted to highlight what we did based on our own working knowledge, skills, experience, and expertise of addressing violence against women and girls and gender-based violence. This was us on our own. Because what happened shortly after that painfully cuts back to the attitude of my colonial ancestors and how they viewed the locals 140 years ago. That the same attitude is still very much alive today. As soon as our communication lines to the outside world was back to normal, humanitarian experts flooded my email, flooded my other colleagues' emails. These were the experts on gender-based violence in emergencies. Their pre-designed approaches of how to roll out psychosocial support to communities were being emailed to those of us in the EVOR and GBV space. A strong message that gender-based violence is different to gender-based violence in emergencies was being honed on us. We were being told that these are two completely different things and needed two completely different approaches. We didn't know anything. So we had to read up on all these resources and all these Zoom meetings that we were being sent links to be trained and prepped to carry out psychosocial support to the communities. We were told they had been in communication with government counterparts and had been given the go-ahead to roll out the pre-designed activities on the ground. So basically, we didn't have a say. It was going ahead regardless. You know, it felt like WCCC and other local NGOs were very much like the locals with no white blood in their veins, and the Tongans who had been employed by these larger expert interagency organizations as the in-country focal points were the half-castes, because they were closer to the white experts, and obviously they had more knowledge, access to resources and expertise. So who were we to question them? Armed with resources and the ability to get to all corners of the most remote areas of Tonga, WCC reluctantly joined these interagency approaches. It was a situation where if we didn't go, we couldn't get out to the most remote places of Tonga, which is very expensive, and we had no budget or no funding at all to charter flights and boats. So we had to go. To them, it may have seemed as if we were validating their approach, which killed us internally. But to us, it was our way of reaching these areas and ensuring that we carried out our psychosocial support the best way we knew how to, and ensuring that women and children in high-risk situations in these areas were referred to ongoing counselling support and advocacy. WCCC and I have had many conversations this year. We have never been made to feel so worthless and incompetent in the EVOR space as we had been made to feel this year with that experience. Despite my 18 years of experience in EVOR and GBV work in Tonga, I felt stupid. I felt we had been bullied and disempowered. It felt exactly how I explained my great-great-grandfather's situation 140 years ago. Do not marry a local girl. They are not of your standard. Do not use local expertise on GBV, EVOR, GBV-IE, because it's limited. They don't know as much as we know. In fact, on a personal note, I left Tonga for about 2 months over the July-August period because I felt if I didn't, I was going to absolutely lose it. My mental well-being was in question. I felt like I had failed as a leader for my NGO. I had tried with all the energy I had left in me after responding to that humanitarian crisis to call these interagency approaches to account. I emailed and discussed this with them several times, expressing my concerns. I wanted them to understand their colonial approaches and break the pattern like how my great-grandfather did when he went against the rules and married a Tongan woman. I wanted them to just stop and hand over the resources to the NGOs on the ground. I wanted them to acknowledge their power over and to stop bullying. At one time, a comment was made to me, "Yes, Ofa, we understand your concerns, but it was the Tongan government who had requested our help. So our hands are tied. We have to respond." I responded to this person by saying, yes, as the government does, they go out and request help because they assume you are the experts in this area in my country. You have a responsibility and the ability to respond by saying, yes, we have the resources, and we would be happy to support your local experts on the ground to carry out the services. That is the difference between power over and power to. And that is how you can start contributing to decolonisation, by acknowledging our expertise, our skills, and our knowledge. But here's the thing. In the development aid context, there's not that much more of a difference. The excerpts you heard earlier is from a research I led with International Women's Development Agency, IWDA, in 2020. I think there are a few copies available. The research is titled Creating Equitable South-North Partnerships, Nurturing the VA. The VA is the relationship or the spaces between the relationships, and voyaging the audacious ocean together. I highly recommend, if you don't get a hard copy, reading the copy online, because it's full of women's voices from the Moana Oceanic Pacific, if you really want to hear the stories and their struggles. My primary role in this research was to navigate women's experiences and perspectives, mainly in the development and aid context, which meant that at times I had to dive in as far as I could, as far as the woman would allow me, into the deepest ocean basin of the entire world, the Moana Pacific Ocean. My own experience and perspectives did place me at the heart of this research, with one goal that we agreed with the 35 women leaders: to reimagine the way we move forward with Global North partners, to create a voyage that validates the voices in the research, and one that enables the genuine creation of equitable partnerships and empowered relationships. The research report navigated through the knowledge and experience of 35 Pacific Island women, whom I'm proud to call my sisters, who have been working in the women's rights movement space over the last 3 decades, who agreed to talanoa with me or hold conversations, sharing the perspectives on the role of Global North organisations and their interactions they've had with them over the last 30 years. There were 3 guiding research questions. I'm just going to stop there and ask how we're doing for time. How are we doing for time?
Fine. Keep going.
Keep going? Okay. So,
We'll listen to you all day.
question 1 of the research. What perspectives do Pacific women's rights movements and actors have on the engagement of Global North organisations within their movements? Whilst there were positive perspectives shared, they were few and far between. I share with you here a summary of 8 key perspectives of concern that can help us move forward. It's a way for us to learn and to also be serious about listening, of which I'll touch on at the end of my talanoa, and to be serious about decolonisation of the development and humanitarian nexus. Number 1, Global North agenda. Global North organisations bring their own agenda to the table with very little input from Pacific women's rights organisations as partners, or there is a lack of consultation at the design stage through to implementation. Number 2, imbalanced power dynamics. Global North organisations are perceived by almost all the Pacific women's rights actors who were interviewed as having a position of power over, an unequal partnership at the onset, or one that does not value women's rights organisations as an equal partner. Number 3, colonial practices in post-colonial context. Impact of colonisation resulting in dependency of Pacific women's rights organisations on Global North organisations, where the partnership continues colonial practices and is perceived of one as donor, beneficiary, administrator versus administered. The undermining of autonomy of Pacific women's rights organisations results in low confidence to negotiate. Number 4, contextual understanding. Global North organisations lack contextual knowledge of the situation of women in Pacific countries, resulting in unrealistic expectations. Number 5, lack of support for other women's rights issues. Issues not identified as Global North priorities are not included on the Global North agenda. Self-determination for territories under the United States of America. They can never get funded, as an example. Hierarchical clustering. Global North organizations perceived as having better relationships with well-established Pacific feminist or women's rights organizations and are responsible for making feminism in the Pacific elite. Number 7, fragmenting movements. Global North organizations have played a role in Pacific women's rights organizations working in silos. And as a result, the wider women's movement has weakened. National and regional solidarity is almost not in existence anymore. And number 8, sustainability and long-term support. Pacific women's rights organizations and women's rights actors constantly fear the unknown in terms of sustainability of funds and support and accountability perceived only as one way. The second question that were asked of these women leaders, what role do Pacific women's rights movements and actors propose or put on the table for Global North organizations who want to engage with movements into the future? And I share with you a summary of 8 points. 1, Global North organizations to co-create, co-design, and to have co-responsibility and collective accountability with women's rights organizations. 2, Global North organizations to develop organizational feminist policies or national feminist foreign policies. This came about because a lot of the women leaders said where they felt disempowered with Global North organizations, where there was a feminist in that organization, they felt that there was an equal conversation going on and that was a key ally in that Global North organization. And that was raised by many. So it was a key learning from this research. 3, Global North organizations to self-educate and learn about the local context and political positioning. So not just to Google and not just to go on and find online whatever information you can get, but talk to people on the ground, activists, actors, movements on the ground who have institutional knowledge spanning over more than 5 decades in some countries. 4, Global North organizations to embrace indigenous and decolonized ways of accessing, sharing, documenting, and building knowledge. And not to be hesitant about doing that. Look at these ways. They could work. And there are so many examples I can share with you from Tonga if we do get to talk about that. And number 5, Global North organizations to advocate for and support accountability. 6, Global North organizations to strengthen and support the capacity of women's rights organizations and women's rights actors. And that's about bringing them up to par with a lot of women's organizations said to me, Ofa, we don't even understand what feminism is. We've never sat down to go through the first and second and third wave of feminism that everybody is talking about. We don't really get it. And so, of course, that fire in the belly and the consciousness, awareness raising is non-existent because we're working in silos and we're told if you're working in climate, you can't work in GBV. If you're working in GBV, you cannot work in women's leadership. If you're working in women's leadership, you cannot work with women's economic empowerment. And we all know that that's not true. Well, I know that's not true. I hope you all know that that's not true. Number 7, Global North organizations to invest in integrative partnerships built on equality, diversity, and inclusivity. 8, Global North organizations and Pacific women's rights organizations to agree on shared values and standards. And I think that should be at the get-go of any relationship and partnership that starts. And lastly, the last question, question 3, what are the key elements of supportive, equitable, and decolonized models of engagement between Global South women's rights movements and Global North organizations? And there are 4. 4 key elements that the women agreed to. 1, decolonize development practice and share the power. 2, enable global self-power, agency and autonomy. 3, nurture the space between the va. The relationship nurturing is critical to any Pacific Island country. And if you don't see it as a relationship, then it most probably and highly likely will not result the way that you and your partner would have wished for it to result in. And 4, contextual sensitivity. Participants in the research Talanoa shared their perspectives that described the power dynamics that reflected unequal relations, of which I have brought some examples of. And there was a kind of pattern where it kept escalating every decade. In the last decade, more so in the last 5 to 6 years, in many conversations with women leaders across the Pacific, there's a very strong feeling that Global North organizations, in particular donors, have started to be more forceful in dictating ways of working rather than listening to their partners on the ground. In spite of the Paris Declaration, the Busan Partnership, and the Cairns Compact, dare I say. The 5 principles of the 2005 Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness: ownership, alignment, harmonization, results, and mutual accountability. We also have the Cairns Compact, strengthening development cooperation in the Pacific, and the Busan Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, emphasizing the importance of transparency in funding decisions by donors and the engagement of civil society organizations as an independent development actor. There is a real urgency in what I'm sharing with you today, because the issues are very real and is still happening as I speak. There is still somebody out there at a desk in an air-conditioned office, whether it's New York, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, somewhere in Europe, or in the regional offices in the Pacific, designing programs, activities, and putting budgets to it without any conversation or talanoa, without any respect for those of us who are on the ground doing the work. This is real and it's urgent. Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs, when visiting Pacific Island countries this year, said Australia would listen and would stand shoulder to shoulder with us. I want to see this turned into a reality, because the root of the problem is when those with power over and access to resources control the entire discourse and distribution and refuse to listen. When you have a team of experts, as I said, sitting in an air-conditioned office, oceans and oceans away from your livid reality, who in my eyes are development and humanitarian dictators, there is no room for real and meaningful shoulder-to-shoulder partnerships. Nurturing the VAR becomes a struggle and at times impossible. Locally led or localization terms become the terms in fashion. But what does it really mean? Have you really sat down to think and reflect about what it really means? Some of you I may have bored you out at the beginning of my speech when I was telling you everything we did. I did that purposefully because a lot of people don't listen to that part of what we did. They just want to carry on to the end product. But listening is such a critical skill that I believe the Foreign Affairs Minister of Australia picked up on that for a very, very good reason, because we haven't been doing it good at all. Programs and activities become a tick box. We revert back to my European ancestors' view of Tonga 140 years ago. They need us. We bring money and resources to their country. There are so many things I want to say and share, and I could go on, but I believe in the power of conversations and listening to other perspectives in other voices. And so I'll finish here. But I leave you with this thought. If I go back to July and August of this year, Tonga almost lost a women's rights leader. I wasn't sure if I was going to go back to my home. It was at the expense of those who, with the power and resources, not wanting to listen to my NGO or other NGOs on the ground. Not seeing WCCC shoulder to shoulder. Ebeli Hau offers preeminent oceanic philosophy in his essay, Our Sea of Islands, 1993, speaks directly to the issue of reimagining Pacific identity from one that is often described as many tiny little islands spread across oceans of tranquil water. Hence the name the Pacific, coined by explorer Ferdinand Magellan in the 16th century. This has come at a price, with the Pacific region often being labelled as small economies of scale, dependent on its larger, bigger brothers, Australia and New Zealand. Geographically scattered, with some being seen as completely isolated from the outside world, so they do need our help. Yvonne Underhill-Sem suggests an additional paradigm shift to what Hau'ofa says. She argues that Hau'ofa's call for oceanic people to rise up and be liberated from the tiny spaces that they have resisted, accepting as their sole appointed place, fails to recognize the additional multi-level and intersecting struggles faced by women throughout the Pacific that still leaves women behind in those tiny spaces. She elaborates on Hau'ofa's Oceania to a reimagining positioning of women in the oceanic space. And when this happens, women can begin to confidently resist being confined. And it's an audacious call, one that I stand here today audaciously demanding supportive, equitable, and decolonized relationships. And it starts with you to me, you to the others who you work with. There's a Hawaiian proverb, and I'll just share it with the room, that Teresia Te Aiwa, a Pacific academic that we all love and miss, she quoted this in one of her essays, but it's a Hawaiian proverb. A ohe o kahi mana o luna a kapali. I ho mai a lalo nei ike au nui ke. A wiki I he alo. The top of the cliff isn't the place to look at us. Come down. Learn of our big and little currents face to face. Malo.
Wow. I'm rather speechless, so I'm going to have to figure out what I say here to wrap up. But wow, what incredibly important messages. I was thinking so much during that, your amazing talk and reminder, and you know, the key message, 140 years later. 140 years later. And not only do we still not have it right, we're doing harm. And we don't even recognize it. I mean, it's incredible. I had one of the things I was thinking, actually, so much to say, had a thought, and all of you should just think about that for a minute. Think that you've had a disaster, and we have a few in Australia at the moment, and it's a pretty difficult time, and you know the solutions for your community. Just think what that would be like. And think that someone comes in from America or Europe or Papua New Guinea or Tonga, and they sit there and they tell you they know the answer. They don't listen, they just tell you. How would you feel? I mean, really, just think about that. And I'm the chair of the Southern Highlands Provincial Health Authority Board and have been working in PNG for some time. And I recently had the experience, I had to sit back and think about myself. I had the UN come and they came to our board and our management team, and they were telling us how to deal with COVID. And we knew that wasn't the right answer, but again, they had all the money. And I felt my own self-confidence, and I'm a pretty confident person, you know, go right to the floor and scared to speak up. And think, wow, you know, do I do this in my day-to-day interactions? I think I might. So how do I sit and really reflect on that in every single thing that I do? And we all really, really need to do that. It was such an important reminder, but you can't walk out of this room and forget these messages. Read what's said, read the voices in this book, and in everything that we do, from our design to our evaluations to think about it, remember, put yourself in those shoes. It's incredible. It's an incredible message, incredible reminder. And it really starts here. So thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor for questions. I have 3 rooms, I've been told, so I'm going to start in this room and then I'm going to go to the online room. So is there someone that wants to kick us off with a question or comment? In the back here. Yep. We have microphones going.
Hi, I'm Tilina. I'm originally from Sri Lanka and do my master's in Peace and Conflict Studies in Brisbane. I could relate so much to what you said. It's very similar to the Sri Lankan context. And also certain local feminist movements being co-opted by some global north organizations. You also mentioned about you believing in power with. I think that's what you're also advocating for, not power over, but power with. And as a feminist, I also sort of believe in what you said. What I want to ask is basically what kind of message do you have in terms of fostering feminist movements across continents? For example, Australia and Sri Lanka. What kind of message do you have to overcome these kind of challenges, to continue local approaches to feminist development and also peace-building work?
Thank you. What I'm going to do is just take a question from each room and then we'll come back and get the 3 if that's okay. So I think it's the Western room, is that right? Yep. Do we have someone there who wants to? There you are, all behind us. Okay. Do we have any questions from the Western room? And I'm not sure I can quite see who has a hand up, so you might just need to grab a microphone and ask.
Yep, hi there, this is Layusa. Yeah, I just had a question about your reflections, to be honest, on conferences like these even. Just listening to you speak, I was thinking of all of the other sessions that we have, and whether many of them perpetuate what you're warning us against. And so, you know, there's something we should be thinking about spaces like this. How do we sort of recreate spaces like this to decolonize development?
Okay, thanks. And then we have the Barton room, all right? Here we go. We have a question from the Barton room. Okay, we'll just start with this round and then we'll come back. So 2 questions there. Do you want me to repeat them? Or okay.
Yeah, the message is on how to nurture feminism in our... So it's a very real question because one of my key learnings in the research was that the women leaders who had been doing this work for decades actually said to me, Ofa, you know, we know very little about the Western concept of feminism, about, you know, the first, second, third wave, and what's happening around the world in terms of the literature around feminism, because they don't have time to sit down and do research and look up all the meanings and the concepts that have come out of the feminist framework. And so what we all realized was, even though we didn't know a lot about feminism in terms of the Western concept and framework, everything we were doing was the kind of ethos or the root of feminism. that we believe that everyone was created equal, everyone has to have access in all their diversities to opportunities, results, and all of that. But what was missing is that we didn't have a movement. So it was almost not in existence in a lot of the Pacific Island countries. Fiji's a different case study on its own, because a lot of the strong feminist leaders from the Pacific are situated in Fiji. The remaining Pacific Island countries were struggling to understand, but they had this sense in them that they wanted to be together. They wanted women in their countries to come together and talk about the things that were impacting their lives on a daily basis, impacting the lives of their children, their families, and how can they have a voice to say that these things needed to change in different areas. And that's basically what a movement does, right? And so I think what we need to do is get back down to the grassroots level and really build up the women's movement. And by doing that, it's conversations around, it's just that we don't have those fancy words to, there was one woman who said to me, I went to a meeting and they were saying, am I a he or she? And I was confused. And I said to her, she said, I was confused, and I said, what do you mean, am I here? What's your pronoun? And she said, I felt so dumb. That's what she said, because I wasn't up to par with the conversation of the day and, the correct language to use, the political terminologies that are floating around. But yet, she was doing all the hard work on the ground. And who was to label her not a feminist? Right? She was the one going out, catching the banana boat, making sure that she's taking a survivor from one island to a safe place in the middle of the night. And yet, we're so stuck in the, are you a feminist or not? And so it's having those real conversations and getting people to understand, particularly our women, that we're, it's building that solidarity. Sorry, I could go on further, but I'll stop. How do we create more spaces like this? I think we do need. The concept I kept referring to, tala noa, is a conversation. And in Tonga, there's a saying, and across the Pacific, we all have the same similar concept of fofolai whala ke wha tala noa, like roll out the mat, come sit on it, and let's talk. And we do less of that today, and that's why we're coming to all these, juxtaposition of issues and problems, because we're not coming back to the basics of conversations and listening. And that's why I brought that in towards the end of my speech, because the Foreign Minister of Australia said it, and I said, she's on to something. I hope that she understands that, even though it seems so simplistic, but it's the key root problem of why we're having so many problems today. No one wants to listen. And no one wants to come together and have a proper, meaningful conversation. We're all stuck on matrix and tables and figures. That's what we're stuck on. And we've forgotten the basic concept of human relationships. Yeah.
And I guess it's also creating that safe space where it is safe to talk and to share, and you remove the power dynamic. So again, you were talking about air-conditioned offices overseas. Well, it's the air-conditioned office and home and the big car and the, fancy computer, and you walk in and there's automatically this power differential. So it's how do we, all create a equal basis by which we can talk as women and as men and come together across cultures in a respectful way. And I think we have a lot more work to do on that, creating that safe space for conversation and true listening. More questions? Yes.
Effective of NGOs and the most effective of NGOs in Fiji is Friends, run by a woman who like you has worked for many years in the development sector, but very small. And she was actually for many years refused any funding from Pacific women because she didn't speak the feminist language of Pacific women. That's been funded by DFAT. Until she without any help, proved herself during the COVID-19 lockdown and went out and did what she did. And I mean, unfortunately, she's gone on to get into politics, but you know, or maybe fortunately in Fiji's case. But do you think it could be that, you know, our stories are not articulated enough for audiences such as this to understand how we understand feminism, how we practice feminism? And I mean, the language is, of course, a barrier. Everyone expects you to speak perfect English, right? And to be able to write perfect English. And DFED would certainly not speak to anyone from the villages who doesn't speak their language. That maybe we need to add on to the more women PhD graduates to be able to then, you know, study more, write more, and be able to maybe educate the Western world.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally understand where you're coming from. And I often have those conversations with women leaders across the Pacific where we get so bogged down with the day-to-day work. Like, you know, Stephen will write and say, Ofa, do you want to do a blog? And then you will write me and messenger me and say, you know, there's an opportunity for a blog coming up. And for me, that's like finding time. We're so time poor. Women's rights activists on the ground, we are so time poor. It's like, okay, when am I? 3 a.m. in the morning. That's when I'll write it. And so we often say we need others to come in solidarity with us. We need them to write about our experiences when we can't, when we don't have the time, because we're multitasking. We're multitasking from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep, and we're trying to influence so many spaces and decisions and make noise, and, you know, and it doesn't get out there to the audiences such as this. You know, you don't get to hear about it. But yes, you know, when you touched upon Pacific Women, we went from Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development to Pacific Women Lead. And I said to a colleague from Canberra just last week, because they had come to Tonga, I said to her, be careful, because it's almost deja vu. It's almost heading in the same direction, Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development. We have no idea what's happening. We haven't had any meetings. We don't understand the framework, the concept. We haven't had any meetings. And our funding ends in December. The Women and Children Crisis Centre's funding ends in December. So I've had those real conversations with my staff. I do not know where we're heading as of 2023. And it's just deja vu. It's that simple thing. Bring us to the table and have those conversations. Listen to our concerns. Listen to what we know, what is needed in Tonga. Don't design the program from somewhere else and bring it to us, because it's not going to work.
Do you think that's why women lag behind? That, you know, I mean, we, in terms of numbers in politics, in terms of the violence against women in the Pacific, it's not like there's a shortage of funds with women's programming. You know, there seems to, everyone wants to fund women's program in the Pacific, but they don't seem to be very effective. Could it be that, you know, the design's just wrong? It's been designed from the outside without much consideration on what's going to work locally.
Yeah, you know, that's like another day conversation with me.
And I think at the end of the day, the key message is here, and we're going to have to wrap up. I think over lunch we could talk a bit more. But I think the key message is here, we have got it wrong. We're not listening. Even reading through the new design, I couldn't help but think, are these just new buzzwords? Co-design, does anyone know what that means? Localization, do we really, you know, what does that mean? Do we have a shared understanding of what that means? Is it just another word that we throw out there to make ourselves feel better? What does that look like when it's working? And so, again, for us to not repeat the last 140 years, let's start to think about how do we actually get this right. It starts with genuinely listening, genuinely understanding, and recognizing that Pacific women know what's best for their countries and their people, and we need to learn and follow that. So I can't thank you enough for being so honest, so personal, and really just these really key and important messages that I'm certainly going to go and reflect on, and I hope you do too. So thank you very much. If you could join me in thanking. That's amazing. Yeah, and so important. I was thinking the other day, even